Hey everyone, and welcome to your social studies lesson for today. Make sure that you have out your yellow social studies journal so that you can take some notes today. Today we're going to be talking about the Transcontinental Railroad. So up until now, we have discovered that we are in need of a way to get people to the West Coast and the East Coast in a smooth way. So really in that big, large territory out west, there's nothing developed. So there's no roads, there's no interstate, there's no trails, there's no way to effectively get materials and people to the west and the east. So this is where the Transcontinental Railroad, which goes across the entire continent of America, that big land, that's what this is. So let's dive right in. First thing is we need to make sure we understand that the Transcontinental Railroad is that railroad that crosses the continent. And you can see the path that it takes. But if you look at the key down here, and if you look at the key down there, the red line represents the Central Pacific Railroad Company. And then the blue line represents the Union Pacific Railroad Company. That little bit of green down there is what's added on later. So ultimately, what we need to understand is that there are two companies that are going to be working on this railroad. So first thing, if you will, pause the video and document down in your journal the definition of the Transcontinental Railroad. So write the words Transcontinental Railroad, and the definition is a railroad that crosses a continent. So, two companies were given the job of building this Transcontinental Railroad. You have the Union Pacific and then the Central Pacific. So please make sure you've noted in your notes that there were two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. Well, the reasoning that they need two companies is this is a large piece of land. One company could get it done. However, it is more effective to use more people. So the two companies came together and hired lots of people to help them create the railroad. But this blue line, remember, represents the Union Pacific Railroad Company. In some ways, it looks like they have a bigger amount of land to take over. But we're going to notice here soon why that is. So this company, Union Pacific, started in Omaha, Nebraska. So the best thing for you to write is that the Union Pacific, and you can even abbreviate UP to represent Union Pacific, write the two letters UP, and you can say they started in Nebraska. So they started in Nebraska and traveled west. So they're starting right where this blue dot is. They start building the railroad there, and they make their way on this path right there, okay? Then you have the Central Pacific. Remember, they are the red line. They are working and starting in Sacramento, California. So in the opposite way, they are starting there and making their way towards the east. Okay, so they are starting in Sacramento, California, and traveling east. So I think you're starting to get the idea that they are going to meet up right in that area. That's their goal. So make sure you have down that the Central Pacific Railroad started in California. We just want to know the states that these railroad companies are starting in. So the government is giving each company land and money for every mile of track they build. So the company is wanting to work extremely fast. the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, they are wanting to work against each other to really speed up this process because they, one, could get more land, which means they get more money because they are getting a lot more money for every mile of track they build. So one company wants to outbuild the other in order to make more money. So the only thing that you need to write down is this red sentence. The companies raced each other. So the Union Pacific had an advantage because they were building on broad, flat plains of Nebraska. This is why we saw that blue line looking a little bit bigger than the red line. So what you need to note in your notes here is that the UP Railroad system, their company, was working on flat land. That was extremely helpful because they are not having to navigate through any type of mountainscape or any type of rough land. They're pretty much working with an ideal situation here. So the best thing you can write down is that the UP Railroad Company, they were working and building on flat plains, the flat land of Nebraska. So the workers here, the Union Pacific workers, had a problem finding people to actually do the job. But after the Civil War, and we've talked about that, so we should have a good range of where we're at with that. Thousands of Irish immigrants moved to work on the railroads. So people within America were not really applying for these jobs and really working for this job. The Union Pacific Company had to look in other places for people to work. So the Union Pacific, this is the best thing you can put, is the UP hired Irish immigrants. That's what we should write. Workers also included former Confederate soldiers and African Americans. So that's why they mention above that after the Civil War, once the slaves are free, they are now able to hold down jobs and make money themselves, which is very exciting for them. So, of course, that population is really applying for these jobs. They're wanting to provide for their families. So, take a second to think about what you can write down and how you can condense this. How could we go about this taking notes without writing every single word? So here's a couple of pictures of workers here on the Union Pacific Company. These are real photographs from that time. So there were some railroad concerns. Native Americans were greatly affected by the railroad that was being built across their land. This is important to understand because when we talked earlier, we understood that Native Americans were already here when this land was being explored and people moving out west. These Native Americans were already rooted there with their families and their tribe, and their culture was there. And so this railroad was about to basically go right through a lot of their territory. The workers were eating and scaring away or just simply shooting the buffalo for quote unquote fun. Now, why is that a concern? Well, the buffalo are actually a great food source for these Native Americans. So if they are just shooting them or eating them, scaring them away, and they're running away from the tribes and their territory, that's not good for the Native Americans. So another concern here was that there were many attacks on the railroad workers by these Native Americans as they were trying to protect their land and their way of life. So it's important for us to understand a couple of things. One, the Native Americans' land was being taken over. Two, their food source was being taken over. And 3, they were willing to fight for their land and their way of life. So these railroad workers were being attacked and ambushed a lot more than what you would normally see. So that is the Union Pacific. If you need to pause and backtrack, re-listen to something I've said, or take notes, please, please, please do that. So let's talk about the Central Pacific Railroad. The Central Pacific Railroad had a more difficult task. They had to build through the Sierra Nevada mountain range. If you look at this map here, it shows you where that red line probably was floating right around here. Look what they're working through compared to where the blue line was. All this flat land versus what the Central Pacific Railroad's having to work through, the mountainscapes. So it's important for you to note that the CP Railroad Company was working through the mountain ranges. That is a big difference. So this right here is that Sierra Nevada mountain range that they were referring to just earlier. So that's important for you to see that is probably where that red line and little green line where they said, oh, they took care of that after. I'm sure their biggest challenge, the CP Railroad, Central Pacific Railroad Company, their biggest challenge was definitely the Sierra Nevada mountain range. There's a picture of it. Imagine trying to find a way for a railroad to go through that. Crazy, man. So you can only imagine that the work was very difficult. So this Central Pacific Railroad Company had a hard time finding workers. I can only imagine. I mean, that is a dangerous job. So it's important for us to note that the CP Railroad Company had a hard time finding workers as well. Is that not a comparison between these two railroad companies? They both were having trouble finding workers. So Charles Crocker, one of the leaders of the Central Pacific, suggested that the company hire Chinese workers. So here's where similarities yet differences collide. Both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific were, one, hiring immigrant workers, people who were not native to America. And then also it's different because one company, the Union Pacific, is hiring Irish immigrants, where this Central Pacific Railroad is hiring Chinese workers. One thing that's important to note is that many Chinese immigrants came to California during the gold rush as they were trying to escape war, poverty, and famine. So over here in China, over in Asia, they are traveling all the way around to get to California, which is the easiest access coast to them. They are leaving because they are also having their own problems. They were discriminated against, and Americans did not believe that they could endure such hard work. So once they are coming over and working for the Central Pacific Railroad Company, they were definitely not welcomed with open arms, which is very unfortunate. The Chinese immigrants proved to be the hardest workers the company had ever seen. This is very important for you to document in your notes. We need to understand that these Chinese immigrants were basically the way that the railroad system was able to get through all of those mountain ranges. They had great contributions and innovative ways of getting the railroad put up effectively. Here's some photos. Pause if you'd like to take a deeper look. So eventually, Chinese immigrants made up 80% of this Central Pacific workforce. 20% was probably native people who were hired on the spot in America. So they had a difficult job of blasting tunnels through the solid rock of the mountains. If you look right here, down here in the right, that is literally the only way they were able to get the train system to go through the mountain ranges. There's no way that you can knock down the mountain. There's no way that that is even feasible, nor if is it doable? So they had to use the blasting tunnels route just to get the train through. So there's an example of a Chinese immigrant working there, and there's the tunnel that they're blasting. So the workers continue their labor through mountains, the desert, and often deadly snowstorms. The Central Pacific finished building through the mountains in 1867 and sped up as they neared the east. Why would they want to speed up? Can you pause and think about that? Well, one of the reasons they would want to speed up is because if you remember, the government says, as many tracks as you put down, the more money you get. So they're wanting to really get this job done fast. So I'm going to post this video in your Google Classroom. Please take a look when you have a moment. So although they were discriminated against, the Chinese workers on the Central Pacific Railroad worked harder and faster than anyone expected. Why do you think they were willing to endure the harsh treatment and working conditions? Pause and think about that. If you took a moment to think about that, one of the things we have to make sure we understand is that these Chinese immigrants were coming from a very impoverished and famined place. Remember earlier they said that these people were leaving for a better life. And so they knew that the job that they were provided was the best for them in that moment. They were willing to endure that to provide for their families and make a living. So here's where the tracks meet. This is important for you to know. Where the tracks meet is in Promontory Point, Utah. That's important for us to understand right there. So pause and write that down, friends. Well, where they met, and you can see this is a really famous picture. The railroad was completed with a golden railroad spike to honor the event. So all you need to write down is the golden spike is where they met. That's where in that Promontory Point, Utah, they put down the golden spike to signify that that is where the two companies met. They were able to finish out the railroad tracks at that point, and that's very exciting. So there's the picture. And here's a picture. You can pause and read that little snippet from a newspaper. So this golden spike is now on display at Stanford Museum of Art in California. It's no longer at the original spot because to keep it and preserve it and keep it safe is very important just for history, for people to be able to understand how awesome this was for this to be built and completed. So the trip could now be made in a week, less than $100 for you to get there. If we throw it back to our very beginning, we realize there was those three choices people were able to make. And it probably took people almost 6 months to get over to the West. Well, now the trip could be made in a week. In 1 week. That is insane. That's crazy how different that is. And people could pay less than $100 to get there. And I'll also put this video in your Google Classroom. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please make sure that you took down your notes. We want to make sure you have those in there. That's part of our active responsibility in class. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you tomorrow.